Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're joined by Chris Hetner. Chris, thanks for being here.
Hey, everyone.
For folks that don't know you, haven't been following you already or seen any of your work, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So good morning, good afternoon, good day. Been in the cyber arena for, probably dating myself now since the early 90s, studying the intersection between criminal behavior and use of information technology at John Jay College Criminal Justice. Most of my career early on was spent developing and deploying, we'll call it data center network security operations for a financial services firm in the New York tri-state area. Was a global CISO for GE Capital when we were a $500 billion bank, operated over 60 countries, about $500 billion in assets, 100,000 employees. I always joke that's where I lost all my hair as a global CISO. And spent, more recently 4 years with the executive branch of the U.S. government, serving as senior advisor to the chair of the Securities Exchange Commission. So now back in the private sector, advancing cyber risk governance in the boardroom community, working with CISOs that are more business leaning to help provide, business and financial context across their cyber exposure so that, number one, we get the proper transparency and visibility into the boardroom, and two, they get the proper support in terms of budget and any types of organizational decisions that need to be, calibrated in order to establish resiliency. We kind of put our fist up and flex the muscle. So, so that's me in a nutshell, and look forward to the convo.
Yeah, I think it's a great place to start when we're talking about cybersecurity in the boardroom and sort of what does that mean? Where is it going? I wanted to start with ransomware because that's one of the things that we've seen just blowing up exponentially with ransomware as a service. It's easy to buy, it's easy to use for malicious actors. And I think it's a great place to start that conversation with why, cybersecurity should be in the boardroom. So can you talk a little bit about, where you think, whether it's ransomware or maybe some of the other bigger threats, where cybersecurity really needs to have that voice in the boardroom?
Yeah. So, whether it's ransomware or, call it intellectual property theft, the traditional business interruption, at the end of the day, it's about an economic implication to the balance sheet of the company. We've seen some projections like globally across the World Economic Forum assessing that the global economy is going to take a $10.5 trillion economic hit as a result of cybercrime. DHS, Homeland Security, CISA requires regulations across critical sectors to disclose, and the current lack of cyber governance and the presence of cybersecurity blind spots just increase this like fragmented cyberspace and competing technologies that regulators are trying to get their hands around. And then that just creates like this pinnacle to the top of the house with the board where they're just totally confused in terms of, okay, so where to go with this? What types of technologies should we invest in? If we hand over, we'll call it like, $20 million in cybersecurity budget increase, how should I deploy that capital in order to suppress the risk? So it's becoming an economic issue. It's becoming a regulatory issue as per the SEC and other regulators in terms of how do you disclose, how do you maintain transparency around treating this systemic risk and protecting investors that are putting money into your company, and there's an expectation that you're preserving value. And so with the boardroom, the conversation is evolving in that to address these empirical threats to the global economy, to our sectors, to organizations, there's an increased expectation that, number one, there's full transparency around where the exposures are. And by the way, when we think of cyber, it's not always like, the malicious hacker, entering your network. It could be, hey, I just tripped over the plug and suddenly, I have an outage that lasts 12 hours. Or I entered in erroneous code into the production network and it wasn't properly tested. So we think of cyber as both malicious, non-malicious, but at the end of the day, it's an impact and it causes disruption to our organization. And then the other piece of it is like, how do we establish more of a quantitative means? Can we express our cyber exposure, whether it be ransomware or intellectual property theft, evaluating and understanding the impact to the organization's balance sheet. And so we're going to be talking in a few minutes here about the need to understand the financial and business impact tied to your cyber exposure, so that we're increasing the transparency, we're increasing the communication with the boardroom, and that the boardroom now has a more richer, wider understanding in terms of where the exposures are, so that they're providing the proper support for the organization.
Yeah, I love that. And before we do dive into sort of the business and financial aspects, I had one more more technical type question, because I always think as a practitioner, right? I think about one of the things that's been top of mind for me is API security, because we're seeing it more and more as a common attack vector, and it's something that can be misconfigured, pretty easily. So my question around API security and sort of what that means to the boardroom, sort of like ransomware, but with emerging trends like this, whether it's API security, container security, do you feel like those are going to be more emerging trends as they translate up to the executive and boardroom level? Or do you think that that's going to stay more at the practitioner type level?
So I think that API security is problematic from a practitioner perspective, because of number one, the prevalence of APIs, right? The deployment of apps, the connectivity to the cloud interconnectivity, and it's all reliant on APIs. And inherently, those APIs, at least from my observation, they're not codified with the proper level of security controls. It's kind of like the Wild Wild West. And to compound the issue from a practitioner standpoint, there aren't enough API cyber experts that can actually require that type of coding, the proper basic controls. So that's clearly problematic from just a deployment standpoint, and the vulnerabilities are increasing. And guess what? The adversaries find this as low-hanging fruit, and they're going to compromise these interconnected APIs. And then the other piece from the board perspective, while yes, this is an emerging trend, it can introduce business risk. It can introduce misappropriation of funds, loss of intellectual property. It could be an attack vector for ransomware, which causes business interruption. The board doesn't necessarily need to know the ins and outs of API security. They need to understand, holy crap. So we're now reliant on an interconnected, complex cloud ecosystem with all these apps running core business processes. And as a result, our unaddressed cyber risk is X. And X could mean increased ransomware. Maybe it's a mobile app that's introducing wire transfers or financial banking information. Now you've got the potential for misappropriation of funds. So it needs to be expressed through that business lens without getting into the technical details. And then the board member says, okay, so if we have this exposure, what do we do about it? Well, that now you should be prepared with, here's what we need to do. We need to embed as part of our API development process. Security should be more of a proactive capability as you start to introduce these APIs. We should be testing the APIs periodically. There's a whole third-party ecosystem that evaluates the efficacy of the security across APIs and can fix. And that should equate to some type of investment that the board endorses to suppress that exposure.
Yeah, one thing you're pointing out that jumps out to me is that kind of dichotomy, that double-edged blade of the connectivity that enables the business, coupled with the risk that it presents as we increase this connectivity, and then kind of that cyclical path we see in security and technology, where oh wait, maybe we should have security embedded as part of this, and we might need to be thinking about security being a part of this from the beginning. It's kind of like that ongoing conversation. It just evolves with the technology.
Yeah, it's total. It's basic blocking and tackling. When I was the CISO, I guess I'm dating myself, 12 years ago, that was one of the core tenets of our program, was to create a secure coding evaluation process as our developers were promulgating code into the production network. Make sure that we had an SDLC process, secure development lifecycle, where we had toll gates in place where we'd have to evaluate the code, run the code through a process, whether it be some type of automation. In some cases, we hired external firms that were specialists in hacking the code. And again, it's all dependent on, it's got to be risk-based, right? So if like you've got a financial application that's running billions of dollars a day, you got to make sure that that code and that ecosystem is on point and tightened, and invest that money up front before you start introducing that code into the production environment. But if it's just like a public-facing app, or it's an application that's not necessarily risky to the business, maybe you don't expend as much energy on that security versus those other areas. So it's got to be risk-based.
Yeah, I think you're pointing out that there's context there, depending on the use case, the sensitivity of data, and onward, that people need to consider. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, we're seeing the push to bring cybersecurity expertise into the boardroom. I think I've read that the World Economic Forum projected by end of 2024, roughly 60% of global GDP will be tied to digital systems. So, technology is critical to the modern business. But this obviously has been a process. Like, it just didn't overnight become 60%. Why are we now just hearing about cyber in the boardroom? This is something I imagine that organizations should have been considering for a while now. Hey, technology is critical to the business. Maybe security should be part of that from the boardroom perspective. I guess, like, what's taken us this long to get here? What do you think has changed to make it a topic of discussion now?
From my vantage point, it's been most of the economic losses tied to cyber. So we see, the trillions of dollars being lost globally. It's the write-downs that companies have taken as a result of ransomware or business interruption events. Like this year, we saw Tenet Health and Hanes Brand both respectively took a $100 million write-down as a result of a business interruption event. We're seeing increased regulation. So back in 2018, when I was serving as senior advisor under the chair's office of the SEC, we issued interpretive guidance on disclosure, and that's being updated by the new chair's office to indicate that whether you have cyber expertise on your board to disclose whether that exists. I know Senator Reed from the great state of Rhode Island issued some type of proposal over the last 4 years requiring companies that were quote unquote critical infrastructure to disclose whether they have cyber expertise on the board. So I think it's a matter of just timing and evolution, and the machine that kind of cranks out the rules and the legislation in Washington takes time. And my organization, the National Association of Corporate Directors, where I sit as senior advisor, we have about 23,000 members, and we survey on an average annual basis. We survey the board to ask, what do they see as valuable in terms of cyber metrics reporting capability? And I'd say on average over the last 3 years, the board still doesn't necessarily understand what's being delivered in terms of cyber capability. So that begs the question, do we put a cyber dedicated expert on the board, or do we hire some type of external expert? So we're seeing a whole ecosystem of law firms that traditionally are operating what we call right of boom in the incident response arena. Now they're moving more left of boom to kind of sit on these boards as quote unquote cyber experts, providing that independent expertise. And so that's another capability that you can offer as well. I've seen kind of both edges of the coin. So I've seen the cyber expert on the board that's a dedicated seat engage with the CISO or the CIO. And traditionally what happens is the metrics are shown and they have a deep dive discussion, and there's kind of a back and forth, right? But unfortunately, the balance of the board kind of checks out because they realize it's cyber talk and we don't necessarily understand. So, another approach to this, which is the position that we've taken at the NACD, is while, yes, cyber expertise or technology expertise on the board, whether it's dedicated or augmented using a third-party expert, it's great to have. But why don't we broaden the conversation to a more business discussion where the aperture is really about cyber and tech risk to our, whether it's privacy, to our personal liabilities. Like now we're seeing directors and officers being, targeted directly as a result of personal liability. There's criminal charges that are being issued against these organizations, the balance sheet implication, the regulatory implication. So, we view this as more effectiveness to broaden the conversation so that the entirety of the board is now engaged. And then if you want to dive deep, you can have that separate session with the cyber expert. So that's our view on where this is heading.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it kind of follows the trajectory that we've seen where, the CISO has got elevated to the C-suite, and now we see cyber in the boardroom. And I think now you're talking about, security needing to mature and speak the language of the business. So it seems like a natural progression of maturity around cybersecurity, in my opinion. I wanted to ask, you talked about some changes from the SEC and such. I know there's been some talk about disclosing cybersecurity expertise in the boardroom, disclosing breaches, based on materiality, which we'll dive into here soon. What are some other looming changes or big things that you think people may be paying attention to, or maybe even aren't paying attention to, that are coming from a regulatory perspective that they need to take a look at?
I think the bottom line impact, like the common denominator, is about being transparent. There shouldn't be any hidden facets of where you have exposure, whether it's reliant on a supplier that has poor hygiene, or whether it's, hey, we made an investment in technology, but it's not really hitting the mark in terms of achieving its stated objectives. And, I've seen some cases where tens of millions of dollars are spent on certain technology, but it hasn't achieved its objective. So you have to be transparent around, where it's worked, where it hasn't worked, and just, be honest about, hey, we need to make shifts in terms of our investment, our deployment of capital. And then the other piece of it is, like I stated before, how do we bring more business, operational, financial context to this problem of cyber, so that not only the boardroom is totally engaged, but also we have the folks that run our financial department, whether it's the chief financial officer, the chief risk officer. We've seen in creating a cyber insurance policy. How should that be structured? Many organizations I've seen don't even have the right policy calibrated to that particular business profile. We had a client several months ago that had a ransomware event, caused a business interruption, caused a 48-hour outage. So they leaned on their insurance policy, and it wasn't written for business interruption. It was written for the loss of personal identifiable information. So it's really about being precise and on point in terms of how you're aligning your cybersecurity program to protect, those critical assets for the company.
Yeah, I think on sort of on that note too, we had a really good question in the chat from Chad. What metrics from the cybersecurity branch do executives want to see more of, and what story do you think that we aren't telling well enough today?
Great question. So I actually wrote about this in collaboration with the World Economic Forum and the NACD. So I'm going to pull up and just highlight some of the exposures that the boards need to really understand. So it's, number one, it's converting the technical conversation around cybersecurity to one that is really taking the steps to establish, the nature of our show here is business resiliency. And on an ongoing basis, boards can engage in effective oversight by ensuring management has the resources, develops a strategy, aligns their budget to demonstrate risk mitigation and financial exposure reduction. So when formulating your cyber resiliency plans and when creating metrics, and this is what we've done through the National Association of Corporate Directors by setting the cyber risk reporting standard in the boardroom, it's identifying where the potential financial exposures are going to be introduced by cyber threats that are specific to our business. So, a healthcare organization is going to look different compared to a bank. It's going to look different compared to a manufacturer. So it's got to be fairly contextualized to your business profile, and identifying, those cyber threats that are most likely to have what we call material financial impact to the business. And materiality is really driven by, what's the pain point? What's the level of harm that particular cyber event is going to inflict in our business? Is it loss of intellectual property? If it's an outage, what's your risk tolerance in terms of being down? Is it 24 hours, 48 hours? Can you have an outage that lasts a week and still maintain your business? You've got to answer those questions. And how much financial exposure at the end of the day are we willing to accept as a business across our enterprise and across our supply chain? And then it starts to pivot to, based on our budget and the efficacy of our defenses and our controls, we develop and deploy a strategy in order to optimize that cyber risk exposure reduction in our business resiliency, and flip it to the board and the enterprise risk management organization to make some decisions around, how much risk we're willing to accept. Here's how much risk we can transfer using some type of insurance mechanism, which, by the way, risk transference is roughly about 10 to 15% of the total pie. You can't transfer everything. And then the balance is, okay, so we have this residual risk exposure. How do we deploy our resources and capital in such a way that reduces that risk and maintains resiliency? That's the conversation that needs to be had in the board, and every CISO should be delivering that discussion on an ongoing basis to ensure that they have the right support and they're meeting all of the new cyber regulatory objectives.
Yeah, so on that note too, because there are potentially going to be more regulations, more disclosure, this need for this cybersecurity expertise. Are there any recommendations that you would make for small to medium-sized businesses that either may not have the budget or the right contacts for the right expertise to sort of join the board or to sort of help them? Where do you think that they can start to sort of build that expertise on the board?
Yeah, so through the NACD, we actually have an annual certification supported by Carnegie Mellon. So if they're an NACD member, they could log in and sign up for the training and certification. And at least it gives them a baseline awareness in terms of where the exposures are and what questions to ask of your management team if you're on a board. There's also ongoing, just general training and awareness, blog posts, and other news feeds that give you indications in terms of where the risks are emanating, where the exposures are, and also a view into some of the regulatory as well as the legal exposures, because we realize that once an event occurs, you have like the immediate impact, whether it's hiring a forensics firm or reconfiguration of your network infrastructure, suppressing the risk. You're throwing technology resources at the problem, but what's not realized and unpackaged is, over the next 12, 18 months, suddenly all these class actions and lawsuits and regulatory fines can be in the billions of dollars. And actually we see this in ransomware. Ransomware exposure from a payment perspective or an extortion perspective is minuscule compared to the tail risk in terms of business interruption and other costs to the business. So that should be calculated and factored in as part of your understanding and building your expertise in the boardroom. And then if you're an NACD member, sign up for the cyber risk reporting service. I mean, that's been now adopted as the standard for cyber risk reporting. It paints a picture around where the financial exposures are going to be introduced to your business, what's the view on the cyber threats that are going to cause financial losses, and then it's going to provide you insights in terms of how to deploy capital and how to effectively mitigate that risk using a financial loss analysis, and then pairing that with how well you're investing into your cybersecurity program. Should you be doubling down on network perimeter protection? Should you focus on zero trust? In many cases, low-hanging fruit is we need to double down on our training and awareness or on our anti-phishing mitigation strategy. So it kind of gives you a view in terms of really where to focus to get the biggest bang for the buck.
Yeah, one thing that jumps out to me that you're talking about there is like deploying capital to address, the biggest financial and business risk. And I feel like historically, as an industry, we simply haven't matured to that point. It's done very subjectively or intuitively based on the individual's expertise or, how they feel the most critical need for the business or security is, but it's not necessarily tied to an actual financial risk as projected as you're talking about. So it feels like a much more mature approach that I think we're moving towards as an industry. And then also you mentioned the course from NACD. I did want to make a plug for it. I've actually signed up for it recently myself. And I'll bring this up here in a minute, but as a practitioner that's looking to move into more of those roles as they open up and those opportunities, like I've served in various advisory roles, but often, from a security technical perspective, not necessarily from the NACD, board advisory perspective that you're talking about. So the course has been great so far. One thing I wanted to ask you about too is you talked about, some incident disclosure timeline requirements that are coming from the SEC around the materiality of a breach, for example. For folks not familiar with materiality, what is that exactly? And do you think the CISO is even in a position currently as the way we operate to understand or communicate, the extent of that materiality of a breach?
It's a great question. And, I do have concerns that we're not prepared as a community. And it's not even the CISO, it's the entire ecosystem. It's like all the tooling that, whether it's endpoint detection or the SIM platforms that kind of aggregate all of our signals from the network, the security operations center. These individuals are largely staffed by, people in their mid-20s. It could be outsourced. They're very technical focused, very signal intelligence focused, and it lacks that business context that we've been discussing. So when you have an incident and, let's say on average you manage 100 tickets that could result in an incident, you have to have the ability to detect its origin, whether it's an adversary from a foreign nation or whether it's an individual, stealing data, and quickly get to a point where, okay, so what's the so what factor? How did it impact our business? And that's where the SEC rule for listed companies are required to report within 4 days notice once it's determined to be material. And material determination is influenced by the incident impact to the company's business, operations, and financial condition. And I'll give you an enumeration of the types of business and financial factors that should be contemplated when determining incident materiality. And this is actually stated in the rule. So the types and costs and adverse consequences that the company may incur or experience are costs due to a business interruption event, decrease in production, delays in product launches, the actual payments to meet ransom and other extortion demands, remediation costs such as the liability of stolen assets or intellectual property or just general information, repairs of system damage, rebuilding systems, re-architecting the network, and incentives to customers or business partners in an effort to maintain the relationship after an attack has occurred. There's also other costs such as increased cyber protection costs, which may include increased insurance premiums and the cost of making the organizational change, deploying additional personnel, doubling down on your security budget, protection technologies, training employees, engaging expensive, third-party experts. That's all, tied to the cost implication of that particular event. And then we also contemplate within the new SEC ruling the loss of revenue resulting from intellectual property theft and the unauthorized use of proprietary information or the failure to retain and attract customers. We've seen many attacks that occur, and because of the reputational impact, customers will move to competitors, and that, as a result, that has a loss of revenue. And then I think we talked about this before, is what's the tail risk in terms of litigation, legal risk, including any type of regulatory action. So these are areas that need to be contemplated as part of that materiality determination. And again, I'm concerned that the current cybersecurity ecosystem, people, process, technology, is, I would include the vendor space as well, are largely focused on addressing the technical levels used to inform measures to mitigate risk. And while the cybersecurity ecosystem continues to evolve because it's such a complex area. It still lacks the ability to contextualize cyber threats and incidents to those business and operational financial exposures that I enumerated before. So that's where I see the concerns and the disconnect, and we need to think wisely and push our vendor ecosystem to ensure that they have the analytics and capability to quickly determine materiality, and that our security operations centers and our incident response team have the right resources in order to kind of pull the plug and say, hey, we have a potential material incident. We need to speak to our attorneys. We need to speak to our compliance folks. I need to have a conversation with the board to really unpack this. So that's where I think we need to go. And unfortunately, we're not prepared.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've been in the cyber field for quite a while, and, large and small organizations, public and private. And I would say if I start asking a lot of those questions that you laid out, I would not get some very straight and detailed answers in many cases. So I wanted to ask you as well, we talked a lot from the board perspective of how to prepare for these changes, looming regulations, things like that. From the practitioner community, for folks looking to aspire to these roles and fill those, needs that are coming for organizations and boards, aside from the NACD course, any other training materials, education opportunities and so on that you would point people to if they want to aspire to fill some of these roles?
Yeah, the World Economic Forum has a board excellence program capability. So they offer kind of broad-based training. The NACD certainly has the annual certification. The NACD certification, it's almost like equivalent to the ISC squared CISSP certification for board. And for board competency, it's really about appreciating the depth and breadth of what it means to be a board member, and that's inclusive of human capital management. It's looking at a wide range of risks, including financial risk. Obviously, cyber is a component, but it's also having an understanding of the strategy of the organization that you're supporting, and how do you oversee and enact proper governance to ensure that your organization is achieving that strategic objective, whether it's like revenue growth or market share increase, or ensuring that you've got some geopolitical exposures addressed. So it's really an extremely broad based knowledge set that comes with experience, but also it can be tapped into using various resources. And we're seeing the role of the board evolve a bit beyond just kind of taking a passive approach. We're seeing more boardrooms being filled with practitioners, folks that got 20, 25 years experience that can serve in an advisory capacity, that can be leaned on to use their expertise to address a matter, or maybe the board member has a network of folks that they can bring in, right, to lean on to help address a certain area. So it's interesting because look, corporate governance is complex. We live in a complex world, and we're evolving to meet those demands.
Yeah, those are some great resources for anyone who's interested in getting involved in boards. So before I take us to our last question, I wanted to ask you, is there anything that you're working on, where people can find you, things that other resources or tools that people might be able to use before I take you to our last question?
Yeah, so last 3.5 years since I left the SEC, I've been working very closely with the risk transfer markets, the cyber insurance industry. And I found some advanced analytics capability that is being used to right-size insurance policies for cyber that has been developed over the last 5 years and sits on top of tens of thousands of policies across 22 industry segments. Now is being pivoted to the boardroom, to the enterprise risk organization, and to I would call the CISO that's more business leaning, to help unpackage that materiality decisioning that we enumerated before. Because Chris, to your point, I'm not I'm not a financial expert. I'm not an accountant by training. I'm an engineer by training. I deployed firewalls. I built data centers, security operations centers. So we can't expect the cybersecurity community to really answer those questions. So instead of, trying to train them to become an accountant expert or an actuarial expert, why don't we arm them with the right data, the analytics that's already processing these losses in the cyber risk transfer market? So that's what I've been working on. It's a platform called X Analytics, and it's actually embedded now within the NACD community as a boardroom reporting capability. So really, it's quite simple. You just take data about the company's profile. So if you're like a publicly listed company, most of that data is publicly available. We look at industry, vertical types of revenue, how that's distributed, where do you operate geographically. We look at volume metrics such as like the number of data points do you have, the volume of records, the types of records. Do you rely on intellectual property? Do you rely on PHI, PAI? The number of assets, number of employees, and you kind of take that top-down actuarial analysis, similar to like how you would complete an automobile insurance type of policy, where we want to know driving records, we want to know your historical perspective, where are you geographically, are you a driver in New York City, are you a driver in the Midwest, and we take all that context behind the profile of the company, and then we pair that with the cybersecurity maturity. So pick your framework, whether it's ISO, NIST, CSF. We actually just embedded our analytics with the Cyber Risk Institute, which kind of establishes a singular profile for the financial services sector, where you can take all of your security assessment data results and then pair that through the profile to create a singular view as to where your maturity levels are, so that when you're having the conversation with the regulators, that it creates more of a consistent view. And then that firmographic data compared and aligned to the cyber maturity data is then bumped into the analytics engine that, again, is based on the experiences and losses across the cyber insurance industry. And then we project an annual expected loss. It's designed to be a compass around where the most likely cyber threats are going to manifest for your company profile. And it's done through a numeric valuation, where the opening salvo to the board of directors is something like this. You've got $100 million in unaddressed cyber risk, and it can manifest into misappropriation of intellectual property. Perhaps 30% is ransomware exposure, misappropriation of funds, extortion activity. So all the losses are tied to a peril category defined in the insurance industry. And our view on cyber risk management, at the end of the day, the insurance industry is going to be the ultimate arbiter for cyber risk management. It's not the tens of thousands of tools that we have deployed across our ecosystem. It's no different than how the insurance industry has solved for safety standards, such as the sensors that we have in our cars, the fire suppression systems. How effective are fire suppression systems across our buildings? It's establishing that actuarial approach, and the fact that we can deliver that analytic in such a robust way that's been like battle tested by the actuaries, by the insurance industry. It alleviates the pain from the CISO to start running these massive calculations, because they're not in the business to do that. They're in the business to protect the enterprise. And then it takes the onus off the CISO. You've now evaluated your exposure using proven commercially deployed capability, which, by the way, has now been adjudicated by the boardroom community, by the risk transfer markets, and by the financial services industry. And here's your total expected loss. So that's been my journey now for the next foreseeable time. But the last 3 years have really been focusing on equipping the CISO and the boardroom with this rich analytic that can be done, quite frankly, within a couple hours, because the data set has such a massive experience over the last 5 years looking at historical data to project where the annual expected losses are. And obviously the threat landscape changes, the analytics change, the 0 days and the exploits will be introduced, and that needs to be factored in and updated on a periodic basis. But that's where we're heading, and it's exciting to see this actually commercially deployed and adding some value.
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick comment before our last question. It's really fascinating to watch this maturity of the industry because, as you point out, this will help arm the CISO and not need to necessarily become a financial expert or whatever, something outside their domain expertise.
Yeah.
But honestly, I can see it happening or helping in another direction as well, which is, it's very easy to get caught up in the hype and the smoke and the whiz bang latest widget, vendor product. And then this is going to cut through the hype and say, like, is it actually, mitigating risk? Is it proven? And it's going to give a lot of clarity to, I think, when you're looking at your tooling, to understand what do I really need, what will really make an impact.
Yeah, I when I was CISO GE Capital back 12 years ago, I wish I had this type of capability because, most of my budgeting around cyber was just, looking at benchmarking data. So, I'd go visit my CISO peers in Manhattan and say, okay, so Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, what's your budget? Where are you deploying capital against? How do you rank and stack the prioritization around the budget? And that was all I had. Now we actually have, rich data that we can point to that's showing, how effective to deploy those defenses. And to your point, Chris, it cuts through the noise because there's tens of thousands of vendors out there that honestly just creates a lot of clutter and confusion. And we need to get to a space where we're simplifying the technology stack so that we're maximizing value to reduce our risk.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of reducing complexity wherever possible because I think with that added complexity, it makes risk management, vulnerability management, just technology management in general, it just makes it so complex. So that'll take us to our last question, which is, what does cyber resiliency mean to you? And if you want to take a board perspective or any type of perspective you want to take on that.
Yeah, so I think of it in two lenses. From a technological perspective, if I'm running a data center or an operations, a trading floor, whatever it may be, it's the capacity to withstand an event that will result in quick recovery. So how quick can I recover as a result of that event? And that's now defined by what's your risk tolerance level. And then if you kind of walk your way up the chain to the boardroom, it's up to the board to define what those parameters are. Like, what's the risk tolerance level? Is it recovery time? Is it, in the couple hours? Is it in the days? Like, you tell me as a board member, what's our ability, to withstand an attack and how, at what point will an outage result in significant pain to our business and our operations? And put the onus on the board. They might say, hey, we can last a week without these core systems because we have alternative processes and we've contemplated the risk and we feel that it's sufficient. But on the adverse, it might say, hey, a 2-hour outage could cost us $1 billion. And you should back into that analysis exactly where to deploy defenses. We've seen this in ransomware mitigation where companies are like, well, we're depending on these third-party providers or these cloud instances that don't necessarily have the right type of backup and resiliency. If an outage were to occur, or I don't have any pristine copies of our files and data in order to recover. And as a result, when they have an outage or whether it be a ransomware event, it could cost them, hundreds of millions of dollars. So I'm working with a company called Panzura, Panzura, that establishes pristine copies of data through an encrypted file system that parks that data aside on an every 60-second basis. And the calculation is, hey, if we have an outage on this segment of our network and it results in 24 hours downtime, it's going to cost us potentially $50 million. You put that in front of the board and say, hey, but if we invest $500,000 into this resiliency plan or into this technology, I can eliminate that risk. So that's the kind of conversation that needs to evolve in order to establish that resiliency. But unfortunately, I think we're leading in with technology without truly understanding the impact when these systems go down.
Yeah, great Great answer. And I think that there's such a space for, you were saying, like the technology people process, I think, to work together, right? And that includes the practitioners and in the boardroom. So I wanted to say a huge thank you for coming on today, sharing with us all of your knowledge and wisdom around cybersecurity in the boardroom, the SEC changes, how practitioners can get involved and get certified. So thank you again for joining us for this week. That's actually going to take us out for the year. We will see everybody early next year with season 4. So big thank you, Chris.
Take care. Have a great end of the year.